So on this channel, I know that I talk a lot about what might be considered the soft skills in DevOps and less about the technical, get your hands on the keyboard, type these commands type stuff. And there's a reason for that, because the fastest way to failure is to apply a technical solution to an adaptive problem. And that's what we're going to talk about in today's video. Hey, what's going on? I'm Will Button from DevOps for Developers. And so let's first start by defining the difference between a technical and an adaptive challenge. So a technical challenge is something that can be fixed with a single or momentary solution. It includes things like configuring a new server or setting the memory limits for a container, defining the alert thresholds for an application, or restarting a server. Now, those types of tasks are clearly defined. They're typically solved by experts. They have a very short timeline, and they require some form of expertise in that domain. And then also there's a low resistance to implementation. For example, if you're restarting a server, you're typically not going to have someone who's objecting to you restarting that server. It might happen because it seems like anything goes these days, but I'm not going to worry about that. Now, an adaptive problem, on the other hand, is something that usually takes time and it often requires a cultural shift, which if you've been looking at DevOps or working in DevOps for any length of time, we talk about culture a lot. So implementing DevOps is definitely an adaptive problem. So are things like creating an on-call rotation and determining who's going to go on call, defining an escalation policy, or building a CI/CD workflow for a specific team. Now, some of the common characteristics of adaptive problems are that they're harder to define. They require group buy-in or sometimes senior management buy-in. They have long-term outcomes, and they require changes in the attitudes and beliefs of those people who are integrated with that problem. They also require collaboration, and in most cases, you're going to face resistance. And a lot of times, the resistance just comes from lack of understanding. Humans by nature, we tend to want things to stay the same. So anytime you try to implement an adaptive solution, you're going to face change in that. So why do we distinguish between these two types of problems? Well, for one, it's kind of what makes DevOps so interesting in the fact that you've got to understand what the nature of the change you're implementing is. The other thing is it highlights one of the things I talk about a lot, that it's not about the code. There's a saying in software engineering that the best code is the code that you never wrote. And the same thing applies to DevOps. But I think the most important reason why it's so important to distinguish between these two is because a lot of times you have to solve the adaptive problem before you even know what the technical problem is. Let me give you an example. Implementing CI/CD as part of your DevOps implementation is an adaptive problem, right? There's technical aspects to it, but first we have to understand the adaptive problem. So we're going to write some code. We're going to merge that code into master. We're going to build it. And then we're going to deploy it to production, right? So let's just focus on the last stage of that, deploying to production. How is that deploy going to happen? Now, without any other input, you might think,
well, we're just going to, deploy automatically, either launch new Docker containers or push the code to the server and restart or whatever.
But you've got to understand the domain to know if that's the right thing to do or not, because in many instances, doing an automatic deployment is not the right thing to do. And there's a ton of reasons for that. It could be because, your infrastructure is just not up to the challenge yet. You haven't addressed that part of your DevOps implementation, and that's totally okay. You're not going to get put in the pit of shame because you haven't addressed that part. It takes a long time to implement DevOps, and maybe you haven't gotten to that. Or maybe there's certain things that have to happen, from other parts of the team. Like before you release a new version of your code, maybe it has to go through an approval process through a third party, or maybe there's regulatory requirements. Or I can give you a specific example of one of the clients I'm currently working with. The CI/CD server is on a completely different network than where the application runs. So it's physically impossible for the CI/CD server to do that deployment. But if you didn't take the time to solve that adaptive problem first, or in my case, if I hadn't taken the time to solve that adaptive problem first, I might have spent a ton of time and energy building out an automated deploy sequence that could never be implemented. So when it comes to adaptive problems, there's a couple of considerations that you need to be aware of, and they really help you identify or ask the right questions to determine the scope of what this change is going to be. The first one is you've got to ask, what are you going to stop doing, right? If you're implementing this new workflow or this new solution, probably something is going to stop happening as a result of that. So it helps to define that so that you understand that everyone's on board with that and you can start communicating that, and you know what's not going to happen anymore so that you're not inadvertently relying on some artifact of that process. At the same time, there's going to be some things that do continue happening, or there will be things that you continue to do, and it helps to define those so that you know before and after this change, what are the things that you can count on? And the third part is, what are the new constructs that we're going to build as a part of this process? And that just kind of helps you phrase your communication with the other teams who are going to be affected by this and help them start changing their workflow or prepare to change their workflow to integrate with this new solution. Because the last thing you want to do is surprise them with it, because if you surprise someone with a change that impacts their workflow, they're going to resist really, really hard. So there you go. That's the difference between technical and adaptive problems. Okay, at a really high level. But I think it's helpful for you to understand, because ultimately, I do spend so much time focusing on these DevOps soft skills and not the DevOps technical skills, because I really, really want you to be successful in DevOps in the long run, and you've got to have this foundation for that to be a true statement. So let me know your comments on what you think about it. And just to summarize, technical challenge are kind of self-explanatory. It's hands on the keyboard, short-term, domain-specific expertise. Adaptive problems are longer-term workflow, cultural shift type changes. Thanks for watching, and I'll see y'all in the next video.